Storyteller's Thread, a monthly podcast devoted to young adult literature and the art of storytelling. I'm your host, Sean Connors. On each episode, we invite an author for young adults to take us inside their work, and in doing so, to talk about their writing process, their inspiration for writing for young readers, and the general ins and outs of earning a living as a professional storyteller. So, whether you're a compulsive reader, an aspiring writer, a teacher or librarian, or simply a frustrated reader who's counting the hours until you get home and dive back into that novel that's waiting for you on your nightstand, this is the place for you. Hello, thanks for being here. It's June 1st. Wherever you're listening from, I hope you're well. I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm beginning to reach a point now where time is losing its meaning. Some days I wake up and feel like I can't remember a time when I wasn't stuck at home all day. And at other times, like right now, I find myself wondering how we went from March to June in what seems like less than a month. Such is life, I guess, in a time of social distancing. Fortunately, I have had things to occupy myself, one of which is this podcast. My guest this month is the young adult author, Francisco X. Stork. Born in Mexico in 1953, Stork moved to El Paso, Texas with his mother and stepfather, Charles Stork, around the time he was 9 years old. When he was 13, Stork's stepfather tragically passed in an automobile accident. Stork's mother chose to stay in the United States, and after graduating high school, he attended Spring Hill College in Alabama, where he majored in English and philosophy. Later, he earned a Master of Arts degree from Harvard University, where he studied Latin American literature. Although Stork had dreamed of becoming a writer from the time his stepfather gave him a typewriter for his 7th birthday, his life took a different direction after graduate school, as he went on to earn a law degree from Columbia University and then spent the next 33 years working as an attorney. In a move that should offer hope to all of the would-be writers out there, Stork recommitted to his dream of writing for publication around the time he was 40. He published his first novel, The Way of the Jaguar, in 2000. It was his second book, though, Behind the Eyes, the story of a Chicano teenager trying to steer clear of the violence that plagues his community, that put Stork on a path to write for young adults. In 2009, he published his third novel, Marcelo in the Real World, which is told from the perspective of a Mexican-American teenager experiencing a disability that he likens to Asperger's syndrome. A year later, in 2010, Marcelo in the Real World received the Schneider Family Book Award, which honors an author or illustrator whose work embodies an artistic expression of the disability experience for child and adolescent audiences. More recently, in 2017, Stork published Disappeared, which is the story of a sister and brother, Sarah and Emiliano, who are forced to flee Juarez, Mexico for the United States when cartel violence endangers their lives. In August, Stork will publish his 8th novel, Illegal, which is a sequel to Disappeared, and follows Sarah and Emiliano as they begin their lives as undocumented immigrants in the U.S. In many ways, Stork is precisely the kind of writer that I envisioned talking to when I began this podcast. If you visit his website, you'll find that he's an avid journaler who routinely writes about subjects that range from faith and art to nature, literature, and even inspiration. As you'll soon hear, we talked about a range of topics, from Stork's childhood experiences as an immigrant growing up in El Paso, to his inspiration for writing Illegal, and of course, the role that writing and creativity play in his everyday life. To help people who are listening contextualize your writing, I thought I'd begin by asking you to share a bit about your childhood background. You were born in Monterrey, Mexico, is that right?
Yes, a long time ago.
What memories do you have of life in Mexico?
Actually, just born in Monterrey, and then soon after that, my mother, who was a single mother, moved to my grandfather's house, so in Tampico, which is a city in the Gulf of Mexico, kind of a warm, hot, humid place, big oil town, where a lot of oil gets shipped out and comes in into Mexico, a lot of refineries and stuff. So we lived in a kind of a middle class home. My grandfather was an accountant, and he kind of supported everyone. My mother worked, and so I have some wonderful memories of living in a house where people came in and out all the time. My cousins lived next door, and there were, it was a neighborhood with lots of kids. Those are the kind of good memories that I had from Mexico.
And how did you come to the United States?
Well, Ruth Stork, my mother, when I was 6 years old, she met Charlie Stork, who's he was born in the Netherlands, but he was an American citizen, and he was traveling through Mexico. And he was older than my mother by about maybe 20 years or so. And they met and they married, and he adopted me, gave me his name. And a few years, we lived in Mexico for a few years. And then after that, Charlie Stork, we're basically living just on his Social Security pension that he received. And we decided that it would be good for me to have to grow up in the United States, have an American education. So he moved us to El Paso, Texas. That's how we came to be here.
In an interview I came across, you said that around the time you were in high school, you were living with your mother in subsidized housing in El Paso, and you likened your experience of traveling between your neighborhood and the Jesuit school you attended to living two lives.
Yeah.
In what sense did you find that to be the case?
Well, Charlie Stork died a few years after we were here, so I was 13, and so my mother and I decided to stay in the United States. We lived. His pension kind of continued with us, and the Social Security pension would continue for me until I was 18. But we didn't have enough to, obviously, we had to live in subsidized housing. There just wasn't enough. And I sort of remember being afraid all the time, kind of hiding, trying to stay under the radar. It was kind of a rough neighborhood. And I wouldn't, to let anybody know that I liked reading or that I was semi-smart would make me different in that neighborhood. And so I kept that very quiet. But I did manage to get a scholarship to the Jesuit high school because I went to church, and the priest noticed that I had no trouble speaking in public, reading the epistles and so forth. And so they gave me a speech scholarship to the Jesuit High. So it was, I was recognized as intelligent in the high school, but I had to keep it very quiet at home. And it was also, I had to kind of survive. I had to make friends with some of the people there. So on weekends we would do some crazy stuff, and then on Monday I would be my old, very proper young man going to a Catholic school with a button-down shirt and a tie kind of thing.
And then after you graduated from high school, you earned a scholarship to attend Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, where you majored in English literature and philosophy. And then later, you received a second scholarship that allowed you to study Latin American literature as a graduate student at Harvard. It seems like you were on a trajectory to teach literature at the college level. Was that something that you aspired to? And if so, what led you to deviate from that path?
Being a teacher wasn't really something I aspired. I think very early on in high school, I started to write in a journal and to write poetry for the school poetry magazine. And so I got interested in being a writer, which is something that I had always, even as a little kid, I wanted to do. My Charlie Stork gave me a typewriter when I was 7 years old for my birthday. And, I had mentioned that I wanted to be a writer, but I really kind of only got serious about it in high school, and saw it as a potential. And so my choices of schools were really places where I thought I could learn to write. English and philosophy seemed like I'd be reading a lot of good people that could teach me about writing. And then Harvard, I really wanted to go to Stanford. They had a wonderful writing program there with Wallace Stegner, I think. And I sent in a short story, and unfortunately, I didn't make it into Stanford. And I tried Johns Hopkins, who had John Barth was teaching there. And I didn't make it there. So I had to settle for Harvard, unfortunately.
I was going to say.
Yeah, and Harvard took me in as in the Department of Romance Languages, which I had never really, I mean, I spoke Spanish, but then I took some Spanish literature courses, but they took me in as a special student to see if I could, like, for a year, if it, at the end of the year, they would see if they would accept me. Since all the tuition was being paid by the Danforth Fellowship and I was giving living expenses, I think they didn't have much to lose, I don't think. So what attracted me to Harvard obviously was the teachers that they had there, some good writers in Latin American literature, and obviously, I mean, and they had this incredible speaking series, where they had Jorge Luis Borges and Cortázar and all these great people coming to speak to them every month. That was kind of attractive. But I guess my goal was really to learn how to write. And when I got into trouble was that the kind of writing that I wanted to do was not really the kind of writing that Harvard wanted. And I kept turning in these research papers that they wanted me to do, and I would get like a B minus, which for Harvard is like, it's almost just like flunking, really. And they would say very creative, but not really a research paper. So, well, I managed to stay in there for 4 years until I realized that the kind of writing that I would be asked to do was just not for me. So,
And then you spent a career in law.
I got the bright idea that maybe I could be a lawyer, which was something very practical, and support myself and my family and write on the side. That didn't quite work out well. Had to be for a while.
I could imagine it'd be a lot to juggle time-wise.
Yeah, I mean, being a writer, especially at a private firm, working just long hours and weekends and very competitive. And, I just kind of gave up on the thought of writing, really, and just try to survive in that profession for as long as I could.
So when did you begin writing seriously with the intention of getting published?
Well, I always kept up this journal that I started in high school, and I almost wrote every day. In many ways, I started suffering from depression early on. Just obviously I was in the wrong path, and some of the places that I worked with were very difficult. And it was kind of the journal that kind of like kept my inner being alive in many ways. So in many ways, I learned to write by writing every day in a journal. I would write about my thoughts. I would write, I would copy things down from books that I liked and so forth. So I was writing, for myself, which is kind of the best way to learn to write. I mean, I when you write in a journal, I didn't have a sense of a censor there. I was very free to write whatever I wanted to. So I was writing, but to kind of say, okay, I'm going to try to do something for publication. That didn't happen until I was about 40, and I had kind of like a midlife crisis where, I mean, I was obviously in the wrong, wasn't happy in the profession that I had chosen. I had given up on this, need to write. And so I just decided that I would give it one more try, that I would write every day for 6 months try to write a novel. And if at the end of 6 months I had nothing, then I would just give up on thinking of myself as a writer. And so I wrote this novel, and predictably it was about a lawyer in Boston whose world starts falling apart. He loses his job, he loses his wife, and ends up in death row in Texas. So I was pretty drastic. Yeah, there was a lot of probably some autobiographical stuff there.
And that book was intended for an adult audience. Is that right?
Yes.
How did you begin writing for teenagers?
I worked on that book. I think 5 years later, that book got published after many revisions. And that book was published by a small university press in Arizona, a bilingual review press. And, I think it probably they made 1,000 copies and I bought most of them. gave them to anybody that I could. But it got a good review, I think, in Publishers Weekly. And a young woman who was starting out as an agent at the time said, the next time you write a book, why don't you contact me and I'd be glad to represent you. And so that's what happened. I wrote a second book, and my kids were teenagers at the time. I had a son and a daughter, and they were teenagers, and we were living a comfortable life, in the suburbs of Boston, and they were going to good schools, and I wanted them to know a little bit about my growing up in El Paso. And so I wrote this book about a young man who lives in the projects of El Paso, who's very bright, but gets into trouble with gangs. And that book, because it was about a young person who was like 16 years old, at that time, it was just like the young adult literature as a marketing entity. It was being created. It was just getting going. It was just after probably like Harry Potter came out and so forth. And so my this young woman who's now my agent and who has been my agent ever since, sent it out to after we got rejections from some adult publishers. We sent it out to young adult publishers, and they took it right away. And then I decided that that I wanted to write for young people. That it was kind of a way of combining this vocation that the teaching that I enjoyed with the writing.
And the characters that you write about are Mexican American, and more recently with your latest books, Mexican.
Yes.
And nearly all of them struggle with feeling as though they don't belong.
Yes.
To what extent is that influenced, do you think, by your own autobiography? Were those feelings that you wrestled with as a young person?
I think every immigrant struggles with those feelings. I think that even now when the times that I go to Mexico, you just feel more at home. It's just a difficult thing to describe, even though this is my home now. And I think that there's part of you that senses like obviously a loss, a place where you grew up, and there's also I think what a lot of the characters kind of struggle with this a little bit of a different value system, that in the United States you are kind of on a path of competition and certain success that's admired, and it's when I was in Mexico it wasn't quite that way. I think probably Mexico is becoming more and more like that, like many other countries in the world, but it was my grandfather was happy with like his small salary and he was supporting everyone, and there was no sense of I want to be, want to have more and so forth. So that's kind of like the part of the struggle that goes on with a lot of the characters.
You have published a number of journal entries on your website, and I really encourage people to spend time with them because they really give a very thoughtful look into how you approach writing, how you think about writing and creativity. And one of those journal entries that I came across as I was preparing for our conversation, you said that you find it difficult to talk about the need for diversity in young adult literature when you're asked to do so. Why is that the case, do you think?
Well, part of it seems like it's such an obvious thing, I think that a lot of the times when I go to conferences, I get invited to the panels that talk about diversity. And I'm talking to people, I mean, I'm really preaching to the choir. Everybody there kind of already kind of knows the need for diversity. So that's one thing. I mean, and the other thing I think that I think that it's sometimes we tend to we need to both emphasize the diversity and the unity. I mean, we are writing about character. I'm writing about characters that are ethnic, and writing about maybe characters that exist in cultural circumstances that are different than that we call, I guess, the majority. But I'm also writing about human beings that share you know same feelings with everybody else. Like Maya Angelou said that we're more alike than unlike, and I think that I get a little bit. I guess I get a little reluctant to say we are special. I mean, yes, we are special, but we're also the same. And so I think that the emphasis on diversity could end up separating people, more than they already are. And I think that the goal, if I have a goal, it would be, if I have a hope, it would be that to, yes, to write about diversity, but at the same time, unite people that are different.
Well, and I think that's something that struck me as I was reading the journal entry. You might not feel comfortable talking about the need for diversity in young adult literature, but your books have certainly contributed to the genre's diversification. You've said that you aspire to use your writing to give young readers hope and to teach.
Yes.
Could you talk about the importance those goals hold for you as an author?
Well, I think that it's kind of hard to put into words. I think because it's a lot of the motivations for my writing kind of come out of my religious faith, in the sense that I feel like It's something that I'm kind of asked to do. I love doing, but I'm also asked to do it, and I have a responsibility to do something with this urge and this gift that has been given to me. Humble as it is. And so there is some kind of and I'm probably not alone in sort of the notion, especially in young adult literature, that there is a desire to contribute to young people, to helping them see reality better, to help them understand themselves better, um, to help them kind of make the decisions, to kind of ask the big questions about life. What am I doing here? How do I want to spend this time that was given to me? I mean, those are kind of the big religious questions, but you don't have to have faith to kind of also believe that they are important. Uh, and so I think I'm kind of motivated by that. I want to add, though, the teaching that I want to do is not so much a preaching or a handing down of information or a handing down of answers, but more like teaching in a good sense, like having the students ask the right question. When you're a teacher, you create an environment where the student wonders and asks, and so you're leading them. Educare, you're bringing out this sense of questioning things that they may not have questioned before, and to kind of come up with their own answers. So that's the kind of thing that a good novel will do. Not really provide the answers, but kind of like awaken wonder and awe and a sense of mystery to things that we take for granted for the most part.
Since you have a sequel to your last novel, Disappeared, coming out this August, I'd like to spend some time talking about those two books. For listeners who haven't read Disappeared, would you mind giving them a sense of what the book is about?
Sure. The book it's about two young people, a sister and a brother, Sarah and Emiliano, who live in Juarez, Mexico. Juarez is probably the third largest city in Mexico. It's on the border with El Paso, Texas. And for a long time, in reality, Juarez was the city with the most kidnappings of women in the world. Like there was a period of 10 years from like 1990 to 2000, maybe a little bit after that. And women would be kidnapped and they would never appear again. They would either be killed or would become sex slaves, or sometimes their bodies would be found a few weeks later. Sometimes they would never be found. And so I wanted to write about this young woman who's a reporter who starts investigating the disappearance of one of her friends. And the more that she uncovers, the more her life becomes endangered by the perpetrators of these crimes. And at the same time, she has a brother who's very ambitious and very, wants to help his family out of poverty. It's kind of an entrepreneur, has a girlfriend who's very rich and who probably will not accept him unless he becomes rich. And so it's a story that takes place in Mexico, but it eventually requires that they escape from the violence that threatens them by making their way into the United States.
One of the things that really interested me about Disappeared is that it disrupts a single story that some Americans hold about Mexico. There's references to drug cartels and poverty, but you also depict characters who hold professional jobs, who come from middle-class backgrounds. Was that an intentional choice on your part going into the project? Did you expect to write a counter story of Mexican culture?
What I wanted to do, I think it was at the time of the last presidential election, and there were the images of the Mexican were just kind of caricatures, and the caricature is the way to fight a caricature is really to show complexity. And I think that what I did want to do, I wanted to do, for example, Emiliano, who in many ways has this, what we would call kind of the American dream spirit, but he's from Mexico. He wants to be rich. He wants to make it big. He wants to be successful, and he wants to sell things and buy things and so forth. So in that sense, I did want to kind of I wanted to show the complexity that is in that society, which includes, very, like you say, people of different classes, even, there's class warfare in Mexico and there's like people who are light skin and dark skin and so forth. So it wasn't a question of presenting like a good versus a bad, but presenting a complex versus a simple.
As I mentioned, this August, a sequel to Disappeared comes out. It's titled Illegal, and it follows Sarah and Emiliano into the United States. And Sarah is held in a detention camp on the border. Emiliano manages to find his way to Chicago, where he reunites with his father. At the time that you were working on Disappeared, did you expect to write a sequel? Was that the plan from the beginning?
No, it only occurred to me after a few months after I finished Disappeared. You know, there's a long period of time after you finish writing, and it's probably like a year before the book comes out. And I was working on another project, and these characters just were still living with me, and just wondering what had happened to them, you know. And obviously, the immigration situation in the United States continued to evolve with refugees from Central America coming and so forth. And so it was one of the few books that I had written that it didn't seem like I had a satisfactory conclusion, you know, in my mind. So I decided to spend some time writing a sequel to that.
There's a scene in Illegal where Emiliano asks an American girl that he's befriended in Chicago why she thinks her grandfather, who's a former policeman and whom she describes as an ardent conservative, helps him despite the fact that he's an undocumented immigrant. And she replies, "Because you're real." I wonder if you can say more about what you understand her to mean.
I think that we look at the immigrant through the eyes of television, on both sides, you know, both sides of the political spectrum. Um, we idealize if we're kind of a liberal, we sometimes idealize the immigrant. If we're on the other side, we demonize. And so I think that I wanted to. It's one thing to have these kind of ideas and concept in your head, you know, about what people are like and what immigration is like. And it's another thing to come in contact, you know, with the real person. And I think that's in a way, if I'm successful as a writer, that's what probably the most important part of the book is, to create these characters that are real, you know, to the reader. Um, it's very satisfying sometimes when I go to conferences, and then people who have had kind of a very, I guess, conservative view of immigration, like this is the law and we should always respect the law and so forth, to see them kind of like at least begin to consider more sides to the story, you know. And that's because the character has become real for them, you know. Like I went to one conference in BYU, and the lady said, you know, I really agreed with you that Sarah, at the end of the book, even though I didn't believe that, you know, that we should grant asylum, I ended up believing that Sarah should get asylum.
And that's what literature does so well, is opening up that space for people to have experiences that they might not otherwise have.
Right.
From a craft standpoint, how did you approach humanizing the issue of immigration in Illegal?
You kind of have to forget about the issue of immigration. You know, I think that I know that when the books come out, people are saying this is about immigration, but really it's about, in my mind, it's about two characters, you know, and the other characters that they meet, and it's a story of what happens to them. It's their feelings, kind of their thoughts, their conflicts, their adventures. You know, they're summoning up courage to do the things that they feel they need to do. You know, it ends up happening in the context of immigration, but I think that as a writer, what makes you a novelist as opposed to like a, you know, nonfiction writer or an activist, you know, a kind of a activist writing, you know, is really the characters, you know, and the story that you want to tell, and also kind of like a search for a truth, you know, so that even the characters that are so-called, you know, that are bad, I mean, there has to be some humanity to them, you know. In my mind, you have to kind of like show their perspective in a way, you know.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the officer in the book who's in charge of the detention center. And one of the first encounters that Sarah has with him is in his office, and she happens to notice pictures of his family and children
Right.
on his desktop, and she has that thought of, how can this man, may well be a good man on the outside, do the things he's doing here in the detention camps?
Right.
we've talked about the fact that illegal is a continuation of Sarah and Emiliano's story, but it is also the story of people who are being held in detention camps along the southern border of the U.S. And at times, it's very moving, especially as Sarah encounters these women she's being held with and hears their stories. Did you conduct research on the conditions that people are facing in the detention camps?
Well, only, it varies from one detention camp to another. Like the area that I looked at was in South Texas, and of course there's detention centers in California and so forth. And what I did was talk to the people who worked there. I wasn't able to go into a particular detention center because it required a lot of documentation and so forth. But I worked with the pro bono lawyers who go there all the time, and so I checked make sure that I got my facts right. But I remembered when I was in law school at Columbia Law School that I was in a immigration clinic, which is as a student you get to practice a little bit of law, and we were representing at that time asylum seekers from Haiti, and so I got to go to Brooklyn to the place where they were being kept, and it's actually a lot worse than what I represent in the book. It was kind of like, it was something like a factory that had been reconfigured to hold these people. And in many ways, like I have this school that is reconfigured, to hold that. So I think that what you do in a situation like that is not really, it's research to a certain extent. You want to get the details right, but you want to have that kind of a more like an effective connection, to the place, so that your imagination and you were kind of like trying to feel what Sarah and what the other women would feel when they were there, which is more the sense of like the hopelessness, right? That the days go by and you just you're basically like a piece of paper that is ending up in a desk someplace, and somebody will look at it for 5 minutes, and and you get the sense that this immigration, this petition for asylum, people are going through the motions. And for a lot of women, the reason for asylum is gangs in their country, or domestic violence and poverty, which are, under the law, are not acceptable categories for granting asylum. And so, there's just kind of there's just a sense of like hope against hope,
Of powerlessness.
Yes.
One of the things that I found really moving about the book was the emphasis that you place periodically on the fact that the people in these detention centers have no rights. As you said earlier, there's a scene in the book where one of the characters says to Sarah, "Look, you are a piece of paper in a huge stack of papers, nothing more. And whether you receive asylum or not depends on when your paperwork gets moved along, who happens to come upon it." I just found that aspect of the story really powerful.
And that's a feeling that, why did you find that powerful? It must have touched something in your life as well, And even though we are not in situations where we're in a detention center, there is something in our society that allows us to feel that empathy that you felt. You recognize something in the book to something in your life, and that's where that connection is made.
Well, I'm thinking that's a really good question that has me thinking, what am I resonating with? And to some extent, I think it may be the powerlessness that I feel in our current socio-political context, in the knowledge that there are people suffering, and that our ability to alleviate that suffering seems well beyond us at the current point in time.
Yeah, somebody in that conference that I told you about, once asked, if you were head of the whole shebang, what kind of laws would you have? What would you do? Would you open your borders and let everybody in, or? And that's kind of a good existential question for all of us,
It is, and you raise that question in the novel. There's that discussion about, do we open up the borders to everyone, and is that sustainable? And the opposite side, by closing them, do we accept our inability to show compassion for other people? And the book never resolves that question, But I suppose that comes back to the point that you made earlier in talking about your work as a writer being to offer hope and to teach without being didactic. It certainly inspires readers to ask those questions of themselves.
And to struggle with them, like as I struggle with them, I look at my little house and in my car, and I say, if I will I lose all of that if everybody comes in. And so there's just some very kind of human stuff that goes in there, that if you're really kind of honest, I mean, what you want to do is reach a point of honesty where you're really kind of like not fooling yourself, with these questions, and you're really honestly trying to admit, you see your own kind of egotism, I guess, selfishness in a way that we all have, at the same time, and then there's this desire to help, and to be honest is really to be, I guess, confused.
Do you find that writing helps you crystallize your own thoughts about these issues, your own answers to these questions?
Well, it helps me. I think it helps me to ask the questions, because a lot of times we just live on the surface. We're just trying to meet our needs, and so writing really kind of poses. I'm kind of struggling with this. I dedicate time to these questions in the way that my characters are. But yes, it also kind of. I mean, there's a lot of self-discovery that goes on in writing, and at least it happens to me. That I see sort of some stuff that is good and some stuff that's not so good. And I think that's part of the motivation of writing is this. If you're writing from the heart, you're going to be. I mean, by writing from the heart, I mean if you're kind of like dealing with things that really matter to you, that have like a really effect on your life, then there is a lot of self-discovery. And I wouldn't say that I get answers, but I get a lot of, I do have a greater acceptance, of my humanity because of the writing, I think.
There's several parallels between Illegal and Disappeared, one of which is that in both stories, Sarah and Emiliano confront institutional corruption, first in Mexico and then later in the United States.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your decision to focus on corruption as the source of the character's conflict, and in both countries?
Well, in Mexico, it was it's kind of like kind of obvious, because you see all this. It's very difficult not to see all the things that are happening there, and not see that that there's some corruption on the government's part for not ending things that could be ended, or not investigating things as well as they should, or so Mexico kind of like already has this reputation of corruption. United States not so much. It's a little bit more subtle, but it's what I wanted to do is sort of delve into that aspect more, to sort of create a mirror, of corruption on both sides. So it's not just corruption in Mexico, but it's also there's also this other kind of corruption in the United States, and I'm not making it up. I read a lot of Inspector General reports about immigration services and Department of Labor and so forth that investigate this corruption, and so. But it's we have this sense of the United States as a country of laws, and and I still think I'm with Sarah in a way that I think that it probably this legal system is as good as it gets.
That's kind of scary.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it has all these balances, trial by jury and innocent until proven guilty, and the need for due process, and I mean all this, and you look at the laws, and I think and its application, and you do a little bit of reading about other countries. I mean, you find that it's with all its faults, it's still a good system, I mean, and on paper.
Right. Again, it comes back to one of the things that I really find intriguing about Illegal is the consciousness raising that the book does. Earlier, I asked you if you'd written Disappeared as a counter story to assumptions that some Americans hold about Mexico. And in Illegal, it's interesting because you sort of turn the lens on us.
Yes.
And get us to think about the very issues you're describing. We have an ideal and a prism through which we see ourselves, but To what extent is that an entirely accurate representation, and to what extent are we plagued by the same problems that we point at other people, other countries for?
Yes, I think that's an accurate description. I haven't talked to people about illegal the way that I'm talking to you. So it gives me hope that it will be rightly read and rightly understood.
I think it will. And I think it's a book that I've been waiting for to come along and to explicitly address the issues that we're talking about. I mean, I certainly think that it's really needed.
Yeah.
I don't know if you recall this, Francisco, but in a conversation that you had with Andrew Simonette on Book Riot, you said that writing Disappeared helped you to transform personal anger into love.
Yeah.
In what sense did you mean that?
I was so angry at that, at how Mexicans were being portrayed, And then I started writing about these two characters who are not perfect by any chance, especially Emiliano is far from perfect. Emiliano is more like Sarah is a little bit like she's kind of like what I would hope to be, and Emiliano is more like I am in reality, probably. But and so I write, as in the process of writing about these characters, kind of the anger turned into love. I mean, I'm not saying that I love the people who were portraying Mexicans in such a simplistic fashion, but it just, I mean, I think that it kind of reinforced in me the notion that if we're going to change our world, it really needs to be done kind of like, even though it doesn't seem efficient, but it's the kind of like one person at a time with tenderness, with compassion, those are kind of strong forces, although they don't seem like that at times.
I mentioned that you made that comment. Your experience of anger being transformed into love as you were writing Disappeared. To what extent was that the case when you wrote Illegal? Given your own personal history, the issue of immigration is obviously very important to you, and given the current political climate in this country, I would think it'd be much easier to feel anger than it would to feel love.
Yes. I think the feeling that I got from that book was kind of similar to Sarah in the detention center. She feels like she needs to be a reporter, and she needs to tell the truth. And she feels like her words are very poor. Like, what good is my little truth going to do? I'm just one person, and I'm not even a great reporter. I'm one writer. I'm not even. But it's really kind of the conviction that we have to use what you are given in a way that is good. And you can take the same energy that anger has and put it into that conviction. And it's not, anger has such wonderful energy, you'd hate to lose it. And I think you don't have to use it. Sitting in a desk for 3 hours every day for a year, I mean, that takes some energy, and that takes some conviction. And it's not unlike the energy of anger, it's just, but it's just a different way of using it.
Did you find that writing Illegal was more personal for you than has been the case maybe with other books you've written?
Some books that I've written, for example, The Memory of Light, which is about a young girl who suffers from depression and is trying to pulling herself out of a suicide attempt. A lot of what she goes through, I think, are in a way more personal to me. I think that Emiliano kind of struggles with his father, his father kind of becoming kind of a different person. And I think that was kind of a personal struggle for me. I never knew my biological father, so Charlie Stork was a wonderful father and friend. I only had him for a short while. So I kind of struggle with fathers. And I think Emiliano's kind of like sense of loss there is probably a little bit personal. And also kind of Sarah's, like I said, is kind of struggle with powerlessness, as you say, and with hopelessness, I mean, to be able to continue with a sense of mission, even despite the hopelessness that we feel all around us, in the sense that we are so powerless, it takes some courage. So that, to some extent, that was personal too.
You wrote a journal entry on your website in which you reflected on the book The Memory of Light, which, as you mentioned, is about a teenage girl struggling with depression. And in the essay, you used the term a courage. As you understand it, what is a courage?
Yeah, I was trying to join two faculties, right? I mean, it was both courage and acceptance, I think, which is what I mean, depression kind of requires us to befriend it in a way, to like, okay, you're here, and to fight it, and which is kind of a difficult. It's kind of both things at once, and it goes through not only depression, but for all of ourselves. We have to kind of accept our weaknesses, and at the same time kind of have the courage to try to move on. But it's kind of a dual thing, that it's one of those paradoxes that you need to live with.
That's sort of what I was thinking about. That term doesn't apply simply to the memory of light. Really, it strikes me as being applicable to all of the characters across all of the books you've written, from Marcelo and Marcelo in the Real World through Emiliano and Sarah's story in Illegal. They all are forced to accept their conditions and at the same time show courage in working to address them.
Yeah, I needed to hear that today too.
As we've been talking, I found myself thinking about another essay that you published on your website in which you reflected on what you call writing to open windows. Can you talk about what you understand writing to open windows to involve or entail?
Yeah, I think that it's a obviously there is the kind of the empathy piece of writing, where you are, if the writing works, then you are asked the reader to see the world from the perspective of the character, who may be different, who may be living in different circumstances than the reader. So it's not just feeling what the character is feeling, but it's actually seeing the world from a different perspective, right? So we, for the most part, live in kind of in an enclosed world of our consciousness, and a good book will kind of open the window a little bit, so you can see more than what you usually see. We're kind of hemmed in by our needs and our likes and our preferences, and so that can be a very tiny bubble depending on who we are. All good books, I think, do that for you. Unless when you're writing, you're just seeking to reinforce, the likes and preferences of the reader. I mean, if you're really kind of writing about things that you're interested in, you're going to open a few windows, because your interests are unique as a person. So they'll do that for the reader as well.
Well, and I think it's interesting that you say in the same piece that if a writer hopes to open windows for a reader, he or she has to be willing to allow windows to be opened in their heart as well.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, that really translates itself well. I mean, I think that when I write a book, I really pick things that I'm really interested in, and basically that, like I said, that are affecting me. Uh, and so, pursuing those questions, kind of, you forget about the reader a little bit, but in the end, you end up connecting with them more than by trying to guess what the reader likes, and what kind of things you should write to sell the book and so forth.
One of the topics that you address frequently in your journals is creativity. You mentioned toward the beginning of our discussion that you don't write so much because you choose to write, but rather because you're called to write, and you connected writing to religion. And as I was thinking about that, in your journal entries, the language that you use to describe creativity often approaches what struck me as almost a level of the sacred.
Yes.
In a commencement address that you gave at Hamline University in 2018, you said the following: writing without anxiety requires the delicate creation of what I call a bubble of faith. This very fragile and flimsy bubble contains within it the conviction that the effort is worth doing regardless of the results. In that bubble there lies the original impulse to create and my joyful response to it. In that bubble lies the meaning that the effort has for my life. In that bubble, there is the confidence given by hours and hours of practice. In the bubble lies the preservation of the original call to create and the why of why I write. Why do you write?
Well, I have this urge, it's a good word, urge. I have an urge to write. I think all of us have certain urges through our creativity that express themselves in different ways. I mean, we want to make things, make new things, whether it be a garden or a good meal or a painting or a good deed. And so I have this urge, and when I started asking myself about why I have this urge, where it came from, and so forth, I begin to see that it's in my mind, I could tie it into a spiritual origin, but that doesn't have to be that way for everybody. It's just that for me, it makes sense for me to view it that way and to see the truth of it. So it's in partly due to my experiences with what has happened to me when I don't respond to that urge, the depression and the issues with addiction and so forth that I have experienced in my life. And so I've seen that there is a good that comes to me to responding to that. And also I'm kind of aware of like an incredible, gift that I feel when I write, the images and the words that kind of like I have no idea, where they come from really. I mean, it could be the subconscious, I'm sure, but there's a sense of being given something. In the case of Marcelo, where I created a young boy who has Asperger's syndrome, I mean, yes, I did some research, but really, I mean, the insight into what he thinks is just kind of came to me. So I think that creativity has a mysterious origin. You don't have to ascribe divine origins to it. To me, it kind of makes sense because it goes together with like how what I feel like it's not only a joy but a responsibility and a duty, and how it affects my life.
I've spent the past year reading books about creativity, and while it's been wonderful in expanding the way I think about it, it's also been problematic in that I can't remember who said what in what book. But in one of the books that I read, the author made the argument that we're inspired to create in part because it's the closest that we can come as human beings to the divine.
Yeah.
That almost godlike role of being able to bring something into the world that didn't exist previously.
Yes, biblically, from Genesis, right? We are created in the image, and God created us in His image. So that I think that creation, whether you're religious or not, you have to admit that creativity, is kind of like at the apex of the evolution of being human, right? Whatever it is that we have come to being human, the ability to create is up there. and so I would continue to create even if I didn't get published. I would continue to write. They once asked Flannery O'Connor why she wrote, and she answered, because it feels worse when I don't.
Yeah. Last question for you, Francisco. With your latest book behind you, Illegal, due to come out in August, are you planning on taking a break from writing, spending time with that adorable grandchild of yours, or do you have other projects you're working on that you're able to talk about?
No, I think that there's a book that'll come out the year after that I just finished. That I just finished working. Is it, like I mentioned, Illegal was done like a year ago and it's barely coming out. But this book, a Scholastic bought the rights to that second book that I wrote. It was the young man that grows up in the projects. It was initially published by Dutton. The rights expired, and Scholastic bought them and asked me to kind of remake that book. And so I just finished remaking that. Or we're in the last phases of editing process, which is incredibly long always for me with my editor. But so that'll come out next year, and I'm thinking of, I have another project in mind. I can only work on one book at a time, and I don't know how many I have left. But my kids have allowed me, have given me the mornings off from daycare. So I have the mornings to write, and then in the afternoons I take care of Willem, which is good.
And I know that you have some grandparenting duties calling, so I'll let you go. But thank you so much for making time to talk with me and to be so generous intellectually.
Well, thank you, and thank you for this for these podcasts. That obviously, thank you for the podcast that you did of me, but the other ones of the great authors that you have interviewed. That is quite a creative contribution on your part. So thank you very much.
That brings us to the end of this month's show. A special thank you to Francisco for taking time to share his work with us. Don't forget, you can find his new novel, Illegal, in bookstores this August. In the meantime, if you haven't read Disappeared yet, you've still got plenty of time to fix that. And thank you, too, for making time to support this podcast. If you like what you heard, you can help me by rating it on iTunes or Google Play or whatever platform you're listening on. It'll only take a second, and you'll help me to raise the show's visibility. I look forward to seeing you back here next month when we'll continue to talk with writers about the craft of storytelling. Till then, stay safe and happy reading.